Welcome to What's the Scenario with PLRB, where we explore claims and coverage scenarios relevant to insurance professionals. I'm Alissha Watling.
I'm Tim Havler.
And I'm Mike Road.
So, Tim, what's the scenario?
It's the 4th of July. Homeowners are a husband and wife, and their son is home from college for the whole summer. The son and his friend have piles of fireworks they bought last week. They set most of them off outside on the night of the 4th, but then things got a little wild, maybe one too many drinks, and the son sets off fireworks inside for the excitement. One of the fireworks lights the carpet on fire, and then the whole house goes up in flames. He is devastated by this the next morning, profusely apologetic, vowed to his parents that he would make it right. But in the meantime, the parents expect that their homeowner's insurer will pay to rebuild the house. So they submit a claim the very next day. The adjuster thinks maybe this is excluded as an intentional loss, but they aren't completely sure. So, does anyone have any thoughts or feelings on this one, or on fireworks in general? I've never been a big fireworks person, but to each his own.
My mom used to drag us to fireworks displays every 4th of July for as long as I can remember, until I was old enough to be like, nope, I'm done. Just never been a fan. I mean, once every so often, but the sound, I'm very sensitive to sound.
Yeah, especially when you're trying to sleep.
Yeah.
Yes, at midnight,
Right.
When
Mike?
I was the same age probably as this young man in your scenario, Tim and younger, we used to love to get fireworks. Now, I'm in Ohio, born and raised, so they were kind of not allowed to be used here, but you could sneak over to West Virginia and or Indiana and purchase some, bring them back. So we had a little bit of fun, but the fun thing at the time was to put fireworks of various sizes into all your cool toys and collectibles, and then see how bad they explode and blow up. It was great fun as a child. But now you look back and you watch like antique archaeology or American Pickers, and just the value of some of those toys now that I enjoyed as a child, now that I'm an older man, that would have been very valuable. So it's a little disappointing now myself that I blew up some of these very collectible toys that I had in the past. But at the time, Tim and Alissha, oh boy.
Oh, I'm sure. I can imagine.
Well,
now that I have dogs, Alissha, I'm in your camp here. They don't like fireworks. They refuse to go outside and do their business if there's any noise going off in the sky. So I like them, don't mind it, but maybe you could knock it off at I don't know, 11 o'clock midnight, maybe, and then stop.
Well, a couple of summers ago, I live in a row of condos, and there's the condos, and then there's our parking lot behind. And behind the buildings, as most buildings do, have dumpsters. So the neighbors across the way were playing with fireworks on a 4th of July. And all of a sudden you hear the fire department because one of the dumpsters caught on fire.
Oh,
True
no.
dumpster fire.
It was a literal dumpster fire. And but they haven't had fireworks since. So yay me.
Well, you guys have crazier stories than I do, that's for sure. Although I have seen plenty of crazy fireworks videos. That's probably the closest that I usually get. But does anyone have any thoughts, feelings, opinions on this hypothetical? And do we, besides the law, do we feel like this should be a covered loss, or does it feel like this is something that he went one step too far?
Yeah, it kind of feels.
I personally think he went too far. What's the point of going to college if you didn't learn not to light stuff on fire inside your home?
Inside the house. Yeah, I'm with you. But yeah, you wonder, Tim, a couple things came to mind because a intentional act here. So you're letting off fireworks that you're not supposed to let off inside, and lo and behold, a fire happens. Go figure. So that sort of feels like it was intentional or would be expected, but I don't know. What do you think?
Well, of course, the student would say, sure, I meant to light the firework, but I didn't mean to burn the whole house down. And I don't think anyone is questioning that. But it's the idea of when what you do is so extremely reckless that it might as well be intentional.
Mhm.
So interestingly, the homeowner's policy, there's a saying that goes around, and I think probably most of us have heard it. There's no exclusion for stupid. Maybe a more professional way to say it is
Yeah,
that
I was
there's
trying to
no
be polite.
exclusion, no exclusion for negligence, at
Right.
least under standard homeowners form, other than maybe faulty work or something like that. But that's not what's going on here. There is an exclusion for post-loss negligence. So if you can imagine, if you have a water leak in your kitchen, and then you look at it and you could just go down to the basement and shut off the water, but you think, what's the difference? Just let it spread and my insurance company will pay for everything anyway. No, that's different. That's post-loss negligence. You have a duty to mitigate against further damages. But pre-loss, before the loss, if you were negligent there and caused the loss, there is no exclusion for that under the standard homeowners forms. So it's interesting that fire insurance and first-party insurance, they historically haven't second guessed the judgment of the insured. I think, well, maybe that's even a good thing because nobody's perfect. And so if you set a candle too close to your bed, and maybe that was a bad decision, and then in your sleep you tossed and turned and knocked it over, well, that's not intentional. It may be negligent, but that's typically not excluded. Or if you put too many plugs in the outlet, again, maybe bad judgment, but it doesn't really rise to that level of intent. I know when I was a kid, I started a toaster fire that could have gotten a lot worse. And I think back to that, and to think that was an intentional, like, was it negligent? Yes. Was it intentional? No. So we're kind of doing this thing where we're drawing a line in the sand, and then we're trying to determine if this conduct is past that line or not.
Yeah, I think you're right, Tim, because back in the day, when I started in the business, a lot of folks still used tobacco products and smoked a lot. And yeah, you'd have, more than one loss that I investigated. Somebody just didn't dispose of their cigarette properly, and it's either in the couch cushions or smoking in bed, and all of a sudden you get a big fire. So yeah, that's a similar circumstance. That certainly was not a very bright thing to do, but it happened, and there was no intent to burn down the home. It was just a silly accident, I guess.
And that's why you have fire insurance.
Right.
So there's no exclusion for pre-loss negligence. The exclusion is for intentional loss. And now I can go back to law school. I think I remember, although it was a long time ago, in torts class, they taught us there's two standards of intent. The one would be you actually intend the consequence. So if I want to punch a hole in the wall and I punch a hole in the wall, that's obviously intentional. But then there's this second standard, which is that the consequences are substantially certain to result. So maybe I'm just so angry that I pick up my computer and I throw it against the wall. And I'm not really thinking, I'm not trying to damage the wall. That's beyond what I'm doing. But since that was substantially certain to result from my act, we could probably still say that that is also intentional. Again, if we take this back to this hypothetical, we're still kind of in between, because the act was intended to be contained within just the fireworks. There was no intent to let it get
No
bigger.
intent to start a bigger fire. I wonder, since the scenario said that these folks maybe allegedly were enjoying a few beverages, could intoxication, or could that raise to the level of I was unaware of what I was doing, and that might be some kind of impact to intentional?
Well, there is something analogous to an insanity defense for this exclusion, but it's a high bar. It's the idea is that if you are so out of touch with what's going on in the real world that you cannot even appreciate the consequences of what you're doing, that would not be considered intentional. But things where this would not be a valid defense, in other words, the exclusion could still apply, would be like a fit of rage. You still know what you're doing. Even if you weren't acting like yourself, you still knew what you were doing. I would say kind of more mild forms of mental health problems like depression, anxiety, mania, not an excuse. Being drunk, also probably not an excuse, because even if you're drunk, again, your judgment may be very impaired, but you're still usually have a base contact with reality. Number one. Number two, you chose to get drunk and therefore invited all of your poor judgments in the future. Things that tend to be excused as insanity, it's like schizophrenia or just hearing voices, seeing things. It's things where you're really just, I mean, you cannot appreciate the real world around you. So I don't think that in this case, I don't think being drunk is going to get anyone off the hook.
Now, if we can't do that, then the other thought that comes to mind is I'm always trying to point the finger at others and blame other folks. So you have the parents who probably couldn't go back against their son and try to collect back the damages like in subrogation. But that's one question we can talk about, Tim, is how does the son, is he still a resident of the household? Do you think he'd still qualify as an insured here?
Since he moved back for the summer and he's still a resident of his parents' household, he would qualify as an insured. So under the anti-subrogation rule, the insurer would not be allowed to subrogate against their own insured, which in this case includes the son. Now, the friends may be a different story. I think that would be an interesting legal question, Mike. It's something that's very smart of you to bring that up, and it is something that we should definitely look into.
And I also wanted to question, does the age of this college age student come into context? I mean, if you've got a 19-year-old who's home for the summer and drinking, which he's not allowed to do legally, how does that fare against this scenario?
So age tends to go towards intent, but usually it's a much younger age when this becomes an issue. So like a 3-year-old starts a fire, was that really intentional? A 2-year-old starts a fire, a 1-year-old. At some point, it's kind of like we talked about with the schizophrenia. It's that they're not appreciating the consequences of the real world around them. I would say by the time you get to college age, you have formed enough judgment that that defense is not going to work for you anymore. So yes, he's younger, and yes, we know college students don't often make the best decisions, but for purposes of this exclusion, I don't think that matters.
But you might help me make my case, Alissha. It was the friend that brought the alcohol. He knew they were underage and drinking. Maybe it's his parents who bought it for him. And now we got a subrogation claim.
There you go.
So, you know, there's a lot of cases where someone started a smaller fire intentionally, and they didn't mean for it to get out of control. And it got out of control. And actually, usually the courts have held against coverage. So there's this one famous case. I don't know if it's famous. It's famous to me because I talk about this case all the time. A wife intentionally set fire to a comforter in the master bedroom. The wife claimed she never intended the fire to spread and only set it to make her husband feel good about heroically putting it out. So that's a real case that was decided, Mike, in your home state of Ohio.
All right.
And the trial court, they said this in their opinion: playing with fire is no laughing matter. Fire by its very nature is harmful, destructive, and extremely difficult to control, and one should not be rewarded for partaking in an inherently dangerous situation. So I think this kind of goes to the idea of this was so reckless that we're going to call it intentional, which courts will often go that way.
Interesting. Well, at least she was trying to make her husband into a hero. That's kind of exciting, Tim.
All good intentions.
Right.
All right.
So let me just give you one more hypothetical here.
All right.
Because I love doing all these variations. Say you have a ring on your finger and your finger starts swelling and your finger keeps swelling and you try to pull the ring off. The ring's not coming off and your finger swells to twice the size. And this has become a medical emergency. So you take the big metal clippers and you clip that ring off. What do you think? Intentional loss or not an intentional loss?
That's tricky because, you know, I'm not a big ring wearer, but for those ladies who do have rings, I don't see them ever wanting to take them off. But if you're looking at your finger getting twice the size it's supposed to.
Yes, cutting off blood supply.
Yes, which was probably cutting off supply to her brain.
Oh,
oh,
that's a good thought.
So yeah, that sounds intentional to me. Like she made the cognizant decision not, or whoever this is, the person wearing the ring, made a decision not to remove the ring when needed, when it was necessary.
But yeah, you're trying to protect your own body, your finger.
Mhm.
So
Right. So are
that
the
might, yeah.
are
So
the-
are you intending to? Yeah, you're intending to help yourself
Mhm.
physically.
And-
So yeah, I'm
and
not-
intending to cause the loss. So you see, we get into this. There's so many things that you do. It's intentional, but when you look at the broader circumstances, this is like if you lock yourself out of your house and it's -5 outside and you smash the window to get inside because you
Mhm.
had no other choice.
Mhm.
If the broader circumstances are that it's the broader circumstances could be considered an accident. So I didn't mean for my finger to swell. I didn't mean to lock myself out. And then after that, it was just a natural course of events. And whether what I did, yes, it was intentional, but it was forced by the situation. So I guess the point I'm making here is most of these questions, you really have to look at all of the facts and tell a story about how the loss happens to get a better sense of what seems fair.
right. But with the ring scenario, go to the local ER, have a doctor cut it off, and then you're not intending.
There you go.
anything.
Then blame the doctor.
Right, and then call a locksmith if you're locked out of your home.
Mhm.
If you can stay
Ah,
warm enough, and they're
but
going
what
to be
if-
there within a timely period.
Yes,
See,
that's the
I'm
problem.
setting up the scenario there, Tim.
But what
Okay.
if it's Christmas time and the locksmith will be double the price?
Exactly. And you live in the middle of Idaho and no one can get there for an hour.
And there was an
So-
ice
smashing that
storm and
window.
no one can get to you.
All right, smashing.
So, Tim, what is our takeaway from today's what is our takeaway from this scenario? Can't talk today.
Named insured son sets off fireworks in the house during a party. The whole house burns down. The adjuster is looking very closely at the intentional loss exclusion. Our takeaways are: the son will probably not be excused for insanity because he was still in touch with the consequences of his acts and he chose to get drunk and thereby lower his standards of judgment. As for whether the loss was intentional for purposes of the exclusion, the argument is that it's an inferred intent for the fire based upon the intentional setting of a reckless fiery explosion in the house. If there's any disagreement on that, it ultimately would come down to the judge or the jury. And finally, can the parents assert that they are innocent co-insureds and therefore immune from the intentional loss exclusion? Possibly. We did not address that today, but it gets into really tangled and complex legal doctrines. So the adjuster would have to dig deep in the policy and state law and perhaps seek assistance if necessary, and maybe with PLRB, who has lots of information on the innocent co-insured doctrine.
Could be another podcast for the future too. Who knows, Tim?
It could be.
Indeed. Hey, Mike, what was your takeaway?
Always go to a medical provider if my ring swells. Number one. And number two, yeah, intentional is kind of tough. It's kind of tough to support that something's truly intended. The actual damage that occurred at times or the circumstances surrounding it would it lead to it being an intentional act or damage. Interesting.
And my advice to everyone, don't play with fireworks. You might blow your hand off.
Good point.
So Tim, if I'm an adjuster who wants to know more, where can I go?
As always, PLRB members can go to plrb.org and open up our legal research tab. We have annotations on the intentional loss exclusion with all the case law I talked about today and much, much more. And also we have coverage questions on similar scenarios, so you can read what PLRB attorneys have said about this in the past.
I bet we have some cool educational stuff out there too on both subrogation and fire losses as well. If you want to check us out under the education tab.
Awesome. And we hope that you enjoyed this podcast. You should tap the subscribe button and you should rate us 5 stars if you enjoyed this podcast. So Tim, Mike, until next time.
See you next time.
The views and opinions expressed in this resource are those of the individual speaker and not necessarily those of the Property and Liability Resource Bureau, its membership, or any organization with which the presenter is employed or affiliated. The information, ideas, and opinions are presented as information only and not as legal advice or offers of representation. Individual policy language and state laws vary, and listeners should rely on guidance from their companies and counsel as appropriate.